Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Persian Empire in our continuing study of the history of civilization. We left off with Cyrus the Great, who had given birth to this Persian Empire, and now we move from Cyrus, who had gone from Lydia in the west, to what we call Afghanistan today, to the east, carving out this empire. When Cyrus dies, his son Cambyses now comes to the throne. It's under Cambyses that the Jewish temple construction, where the Jews had come back into the land, they had begun rebuilding their temple, and now it's halted. Ultimately by Cambyses, although he isn't really too concerned about what's going on there. Meanwhile, he murders his own brother, Smerdis, and that's going to play a part in the story. So we have to mention it. He murders his brother, but he keeps it hidden, so it's not well known, at least this is the way the story goes, that he's murdered his brother, and now he invades Egypt. He goes down to Egypt, conquers Egypt, and establishes himself as the beginning of the 27th dynasty. He's going to be the guy on top. Remember, we're going to see a total of 30 dynasties, so there's still a few more to come. And now he decides he's going to go west across the Sahara Desert, and he decides he's going to invade Carthage. Now, I don't know if he had any idea how far away Carthage was. The story goes that he sends an entire army out in the desert to march all the way to Carthage, and they leave Egypt and they march out into the desert, and we never hear from them again. There have been all sorts of treasure hunters trying to find the lost army of Cambyses that died somewhere in the desert, and their bones and whatever they took with them is lost forever there in the Sahara Desert. Well, Cambyses, meanwhile, the story goes that he hears of Smerdis taking over back in Susa, back in the Persian Empire, while he's in Egypt. And he knows that can't have happened because he had killed Smerdis. But there's somebody who's pretending to be Smerdis, can we call him a pseudo-Smerdis, who's back in the Persian Empire pretending to be his brother, claiming legitimacy. And so Cambyses goes and he jumps on a horse to head back to Persia, and the story goes that when he does so, he wasn't too careful about his weaponry and inadvertently stabs himself with his own weapon, spear, sword, whatever it was, and he dies. You can still see his tomb today, and so now he's died, leaving this pseudo-Smerdis back in Persia. And so here's our outline. We'd had noticed near the bottom we had Cyrus the Great, and then Cambyses, and then Smerdis, and now we have that one pretending to be Smerdis. Well, we're out of legitimate heirs. Who's it going to be? We're going to go to a very distant cousin. It's going to be one named Darius Hystaspes. We'll know him as Darius the Great. And he and 7 other nobles who actually know the real Smerdis, and they have come to the conclusion that this fellow isn't the real fellow, they organize a palace coup, and they take this Smerdis, whether he was the real one or the fake one, they take him and they put him to death. And Darius now is going to assume the crown. He'll be Darius the Great. He'll now be the ruler of the Persian Empire, and he's going to form what will be a lasting dynasty for a number of generations. So he captures Babylon and he reorganizes the government. He's going to engage in warfare, but really his claim to fame is going to be his reorganization. It's under him that the temple is completed, And actually, the Jewish people, their prophets Haggai and Zechariah had said, hey, start building, and they didn't have permission, but they went ahead anyway. And then word gets back to him, hey, the Jewish people are rebuilding, and he orders an investigation. And in the investigation, his distant cousin Cyrus the Great had given permission. So he says, oh, if he gave permission, then that's fine. You can continue rebuilding, you can finish it, and we'll help pay for it. After all, it's your taxes at work. And so the Jewish temple is completed. And he also does construction of palaces at the ancient Elamite capital of Susa, which is now going to be his capital of the Persian Empire, and also another capital city at Persepolis. Persepolis is an amazing wonder. Now, it's going to be destroyed by Alexander the Great, but in destroying it, it's going to sort of burn. He'll burn these palaces. But you can go and see the ruins of the great columns and the colonnades, and these all stand as tribute to the building program of Darius the Great. Here's a scene of Ahura Mazda. The Persians during this period, they are monotheists. They picture their god as being able to go. Notice the wings; he can just move in any direction, but they are monotheists. And so he builds and he builds, but then he's going to go to war. And we look at some of the building program. The war that we mentioned, his empire, first of all, his empire is going to stretch from the Aegean all the way to India and Afghanistan. Takes in Egypt, takes in Mesopotamia. It's the largest empire that the world will see for a long, long time. You say, wait a second, Alexander the Great is going to conquer that. Yeah, but Alexander, once he dies, the empire is going to fall apart. So this is really going to be the empire of the Persians. It is said that about his he had a system for delivering mail, official mail, not just anybody's mail, and he would have what would be the forerunners of the American Pony Express, with riders that would be ready to take a letter from one end of the empire to another. And we read in Herodotus that these are stayed neither by snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness, from accomplishing their appointed courses with all speed. That description is used by the American Postal Service as sort of their theme, that neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness stops the mail from getting through. That's sort of the idea of the American postal system, is patterned after that of the Persians. Now, Darius has an inscription of himself. We mentioned this when we were first starting out. The Behistun Inscription. It actually wasn't found in 1842. It was first somebody did a climb up there, and notice the inscription. It's way up on the top of a cliff. Let's zoom in on that, and that's Darius. He's the big fellow on the left. And he writes this inscription telling the story that we just told of how there was a Suitus Murtus, and he and some other nobles, they took over, and Ahura Mazda, pictured in the center of the inscription, smiled upon him, and now he's the great king of the Persian Empire. The inscription was studied by Sir Henry Rawlinson in 1835. Later on, George Cameron made further copies in 1946, and that was a big deal, because to get up there you have to go way up the mountainside. Now here's some folks, apparently I'm not sure how they got up there. There's no stairway, but the inscription was in Old Persian and Elamite and Akkadian, so the same inscription in 3 languages. We also found a copy of that inscription in Egypt in Aramaic, at least a portion of the inscription. So it made the rounds. And that's neat, because as a result of that, we were able to read the Old Persian and then the Elamite in order to translate the Akkadian cuneiform. And that gave, just like the Rosetta Stone was a key to give us the old hieroglyphs, the Behistun inscription was a key to help us crack the Akkadian cuneiform language and writing. And so, as a result, we're able to now read Akkadian cuneiform. Well, as I said before, Darius was a great organizer, not that good in warfare, and he's got a problem, and that's the Scythians to the north of his empire are always coming down and raiding, and they'll take whatever they can on their horses and then turn around and go back. And you go to sort of challenge them, and they've gone back into that area of Crimea to the north of the Black Sea, and so Cyrus gets the idea that Darius gets the idea he's going to organize an expedition across the Dardanelles and around the west side of the Black Sea, and he'll come up against the Scythians from behind, where they won't be able to run away. He'll sort of capture them in a vice. And it's I want to say it's a great idea. It's an interesting idea. It's not going to work at all. Because the Scythians, they don't have any cities. They live in their wagons, and they're sort of a nomadic people. And if Darius comes up against them, they just move away. And then they send their cavalry to come and attack with guerrilla raids. And so the expedition is an abysmal failure. However, while that's happening, the Ionian cities, and Ionian, they speak a form of Ionian, what's called Greek. So these are Greek cities in western Anatolia. They are encouraged by Athens to revolt. They get some support from Athens, and they revolt against Darius. Now he comes back and he punishes those cities heavily. The revolt does not succeed. So he comes back. His military expedition against the Scythians didn't work out at all. But now he's really sort of angry with the Greeks, and he says, I'm going to come back and get you. And that happens in 490 BC, when he sets sail from Ephesus and comes up to a place near Athens. Now, Athens is inland, so you can't sail right up to Athens. So, a place about 26 miles from Athens, known as Marathon. And at Marathon, the Persians vastly outnumber the Greeks, and the Persians they've got the greatest army in the world, and the Greeks have got there's a number of Greek city-states. Greece has no real unity at this time, and yet at the Battle of Marathon, this greatly inferior force of Greeks meets the Persians, and they defeat the Persians. Through an envelopment strategy where the hero of Marathon takes his major forces and puts them on the wings, and the Persian center just moves forward, and those wings sweep around the Persians, and the Persians suffer a great defeat, even lose some of their ships. Now, when I say great defeat, their bulk of their army is still intact. They lost a number of men, and the story goes that a runner goes to Athens with news of the victory. He runs the 26 miles, and that's why a marathon today is considered 26 miles. He runs the 26 miles, and he says, "We have won the victory," and then he falls over and dies, which you shouldn't be running a marathon if you haven't trained up to that level, and so that's probably not good news. But then, after the death of Darius, now we have his son Xerxes who comes to the throne. And Xerxes initially deals with rebellion in the empire. There's Egypt and Babylon, both of which rebel, both of which rebellions are put down very strongly. And now he decides to pick up where his father had left off. His father had tried to invade Greece. The Battle of Marathon hadn't worked out so well. Had turned around and gone home. Now Xerxes decides, I'm going to invade Greece. And so he comes up, of course, Greece is a different continent, and you have to get over to that continent. So they come up to the area near Troy, and they're going to cross the Hellespont by building a bridge. Now, that's about a mile across the Hellespont by barge, by ferry. But it's about a mile across, and so he has a bridge built. They can't build bridges that big, and so they take their entire navy and they lash ships together, and they build not one but 3 bridges across the Hellespont with these ships that are tied one to the other. And so they cross the Hellespont and come up around what was called Macedonia back then. Not too much. The Macedonians sort of let them come. And they're making their way down Achaia, down towards central Greece. And they come to an area known as Thermopylae, the hot gates. Like a thermostat has to do with temperature, and so Thermopylae are the hot gates. This is a name for some hot springs in the area. And at the pass of Thermopylae, they're making they're just doing the land route, they're moving toward Athens, and they're met there by a collection of Greeks, but led by 300 Spartans. You say 300 isn't very many. Well, Sparta, meanwhile, is in the south, and they had some special events that were going on, celebrations and so on, religious celebrations that they didn't want to leave. And they were saying, by the way, besides, we think Corinth is a better place to defend. And so they only sent 300 under King Leonidas. But these 300, along with other Greeks, they're not the only ones there. Some Thessalians and other groups, they're holding this very narrow pass at Thermopylae. And King Leonidas, the Spartans always had 2 generals. Sort of reminds me of the Romans later on, who would have 2 consuls. They always had 2 kings with equal weights. That way one wouldn't become a tyrant. And Leonidas leads this expedition, and they're holding off the Persians for some time until a Greek renegade, the story is told how he shows the Persians a pass around the mountains, and they come up behind Leonidas and his force and trap them. And here in this narrow area, and you can still go there today, you can still see the statues of Leonidas and his 300, and they're taken by the Persians. And they refuse to surrender, and they die to the last man. So that's the Battle of Thermopylae. The Greeks now move on to Athens, and they capture Athens and burn it to the ground. So when you look today at the Parthenon, that's built after this, because that's going to be destroyed by the Persians. And now the Persians come and are going to meet the Greeks in a naval battle, the Battle of Salamis, where the Greeks have come into a narrow, it's not really a harbor, it's a narrow channel, and it looks like they're sort of trapped by the Persians. And in this narrow channel, the Persians try to attack them, but it's a bit too narrow. It's a little bit like Thermopylae, the narrow pass there, only this narrow pass is in the water. It's not quite that narrow. But in this naval battle, Xerxes is watching the battle from the shore. He's watching his ships that come into this narrow area, and the Persian ships can't maneuver quite so well. And so they are defeated. Now, the whole Persian navy isn't sunk, but they're defeated in this naval battle at Salamis. And the Persians turn around and they take their navy back home. Xerxes, he decides, okay, I'm done. He leaves his brother-in-law and a Persian army there to fight the next year. He goes back home, and the Persians are defeated the following year in a land battle. And after that, the Persians pack up, and they're not going to set foot in Greece again. And so, one if by land, two if by sea, the Persians now have given Greece back to the Greeks. So Xerxes goes home. The invasion of Greece didn't work. We usually believe the events of the book of Esther, and it mentions a king Ahasuerus, and most scholars think that's another name for Xerxes. That the book of Esther now takes place in those following years after 480 BC, after the invasion of Greece that didn't work out, and Xerxes eventually is assassinated. His tomb is built up on a mountainside, has pictures of him at the top. But now Xerxes has died, and his son Artaxerxes, there's going to be a few of them, so we'll call him Artaxerxes I, now becomes the king. And Artaxerxes I, 465 to 424, good long reign. And he takes a new policy toward the Greeks. He says, I'm not going to go and try to invade Greece. I can hire them to do it to each other. And he financially supports the enemies of Athens. That's going to be Sparta. And he's going to let them duke it out. And they will. They'll fight, almost fight each other to extinction. They're going to have the long Peloponnesian War. And he, meanwhile, gives sanctuary to Themistocles, the Athenian hero, at Salamis. After Salamis, in Athens, you could never be too popular. If you did, they would vote you out. They would actually take a vote and put it on pieces of broken pottery called ostraca. And so Themistocles was ostracized. His name won the popularity contest, and he had to leave Athens because he became the most unpopular person. And so Artaxerxes gives him sanctuary in Persia. This is also the time when Ezra is given a commission and allowed to take another group back to the land of the Jews. So the latter part of the book of Ezra now takes place. And also Nehemiah will be given a commission to go back to Judah, to Jerusalem, to rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. So among the Jews, this is all taking place in the days of Artaxerxes. You first had that return. The first return had been in the book of Ezra, chapters 1 through 6. That had been in the days of Cyrus the Great, under the Zerubbabel, the Persian king Cyrus. But now Artaxerxes I, also known as Artaxerxes Longimanus, maybe Artaxerxes the Tall, we could call him. It's under him that we have the returns of Ezra and Nehemiah. So that a decree initially had been that as many as wanted to go back could go back and rebuild the temple, but now there's permission to go back and worship in the temple, and under Nehemiah, permission is given to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and they do that. Of course, the prophets, Haggai and Zechariah, had been there for the rebuilding of the temple. Now the prophet, I suppose we could associate him with, because he's either at Nehemiah's day or maybe a little bit later, and that's Malachi. And so the Jerusalem is rebuilt, and the temple has been rebuilt, and now the walls have been rebuilt. And the Jews are back in their land, the kingdom of Judah. We'll come back and look at them a bit later, but they have virtual peace, except for that instance in the days of Esther. I was going to say they have peace in the days of the Persian Empire, but there's an event that takes place in the book of Esther, and it's only mentioned in Esther. We don't read about it in any of the Persian documents, because, after all, the Persians are usually more interested in writing about themselves than about other peoples. Well, we have Artaxerxes I, and then when he dies, he's got three sons. Xerxes II is going to be king, but he's murdered by his brother Scythians after only a 45-day reign. And then Scythians is himself killed by Darius the Second, but for maybe the excuse is, well, you killed our brother. But now Darius II is now going to be the ruler of the Persians for a time. It's during the period of Darius II that we have some writings that have come to light at a city called Elephantine. The island of the elephants is near the modern Aswan Dam. And at this location, they found some inscriptions, some actual letters, official letters, that were written by the commander of the Jewish garrison, but he's not in Israel, he's not in Judah, he's in southern Egypt. And in these Elephantine Papyri, and they're papyri, they're written in Aramaic, it's written on both sides of the papyrus. These are official letters of petition requesting, by this Jewish commander, he's requesting to rebuild the place of worship that they have there in southern Egypt. Now, he's not talking about Jerusalem. In southern Egypt, apparently they have a temple that's been damaged, written around 407 BC, and discovered on January 1st, 1907. And meanwhile, at this time when that's being written, we have the time of the Greek wars, the Peloponnesian Wars are taking place, with the Persians that are funding, actually they're funding the Spartans. It's Athens versus Sparta, and it's a sea versus land war, and the Persians are just sitting back and watching it happen, and the Spartans win a great victory, but in doing so, both sides have been greatly, greatly diminished. And we're not going to see Athens as a great city after this. We're not really going to see the Spartans as great after this. And back in Persia, we'd had Darius II. He has two sons. And wouldn't you know it, with two sons, that's going to lead to civil war. And so we have Artaxerxes II, who becomes the king, but his brother Cyrus III is going to come after the throne and is going to hire mercenaries, including a Greek mercenary by the name of Xenophon. He's actually Athenian, but it's mostly Spartan. So Xenophon he's sort of the odd man out. He's Athenian, but it's mostly Spartan mercenaries who are hired to come and fight in Persia. Okay, at the Battle of Cunaxa then, 401 BC, the Greek mercenaries under Cyrus III, he's fighting his brother Artaxerxes II, the Greek mercenaries under Cyrus III win the battle. But in the fighting, Cyrus III actually dies. So they've won the battle for Cyrus, but he's not alive to enjoy the victory. The person that hired them is sponsoring them, and who's going to pay them has just died. And so the Greek generals are invited by Artaxerxes II to come and negotiate, and they come to a meeting, and they are all murdered. And so now their Greeks are there. They're leaderless. Their generals have all been killed. What are they going to do? Well, that doesn't stop them. The Greeks hold an election. After all, they're Greeks. They do that sort of thing. And they elect Xenophon, this Athenian nobleman. He'd been with them. He'd been not one of the generals, but one of the lesser captains. And they elect him to the position, and he leads them up the Tigris-Euphrates, up the Tigris River, all the way to the Black Sea. And from the Black Sea, they find shipping, and they are able to build ships. They fight their way all the way back home. Under hostile conditions, being constantly attacked by the Persians, and yet the Persians are unable to stop them, which reflects both on the strength of the Greeks and maybe a bit on the weakness of the Persians during this period. So we had Cyrus III, he was the one that died. Artaxerxes II is going to continue now, and he's followed by Artaxerxes III, also known as Ukos, and Artaxerxes III has a eunuch named Bagoas, who perhaps arranges for his death, and when he dies, his son Arses is put into his place. But Bagoas, this court eunuch, is trying to pull the strings. And when Arses doesn't do exactly what his handler wants him to do, then Bagoas has Arses poisoned and has a new nobleman put to the elevated to the throne, who will now be Darius III. Darius III sees the handwriting on the wall and has Bagoas put to death before he can be poisoned. And now Darius III will be the new king of the Persian Empire. And Darius III actually seems like he, had a handle on things and maybe could have restored the Persian Empire because it was declining now with all of these changes. But he's not going to get a chance to do that. Instead, what's going to happen, we're going to see a new king rising from Macedonia, from the Greeks, and that's going to be Alexander the Great, who will cross over the Hellespont, coming from west to east now. The Persians had always been trying to invade Greece, and now it's going to be the Greeks that come into Asia Minor, Anatolia, and Alexander will, with one campaign after another, he'll march through Egypt, he'll come back and he'll take Babylon, he'll take Susa, he'll defeat the Persians in battle after battle after battle, and eventually will march all the way to the Hindu Kush and even into India. But we'll save that story for next time.